Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jon Meyer, and today I am going to be talking about a topic near and dear to my heart. It is longevity planning. Longevity planning oftentimes is in the media talked about as just a health trend, but there's a lot that goes along with it that's not just health related. So today, what I'm going to do is dig into longevity planning from the perspective of our services as well, because at the end of the day, we end up speaking about this topic quite a bit, quite honestly, with people. So what I want to do is dig into it a little bit, and I'm going to start with saying that uh, everything we talk about today, per usual, is very specific sometimes to specific cases. So make sure that you check in with other people. For example, today, if I talk about medicine in any way, you actually might want to talk with your doctor, not just talking to financial advisors and CPAs. But I will talk a little bit about some interesting ideas. So with that, let's get started. Also want to point out that there are other people here if you want to talk about anything here at BGM. Today's agenda is going to start with me just defining a little bit more what longevity planning is. And then I'm going to dig into this from the different perspective, which is a trade-off between health, wealth, and time. And follow it up with a few slides at the end about some resources and some ideas about how you can, in effect, add longevity to your life. So from our standpoint, let's get into this. I should also point out, if you want, there is a Q&A box. So if you have questions along the way, feel free to ask them. Some of what I'm going to talk about is stuff that I've talked about with clients on and off for many, many years. And I think it's just coming into more of a focal point nowadays, because for the most part, we're talking with people that are going to outlive their money. And I think that's where we want to start. We end up seeing most people get to a point in life where they may worry about their money, but really they tend to pass away with a lot of money left over. And I always look at it and ask, are you really enjoying your money? Perfect example of this, and a lot of people have heard me say this, is if you are taking a trip overseas, particularly if you have any minor health issues like arthritis or anything, but even if you're just going overseas, if you can afford to take it first class, why wouldn't you fly first class and show up refreshed and ready to jump into a fun trip, as opposed to showing up exhausted because you sat back in coach when you didn't need to? And this is hard for people to get that concept in mind sometimes. So today is a big mind shift. What I don't want to say, though, and I'll start with this, is that longevity is not about living forever. That's not what we're going to talk about, because if you live forever but you're sick, it's not fun. And I have a slide to talk about this a little bit. So from our standpoint, this is about, what do you do with the quality of the life you have? And are there things you can do to improve that quality of life while living longer? That's the perspective I want to take today. So the balance really is a triangle between health, wealth, and time. And what I want you to think about is, in this triangle, think of the edges of this triangle as rubber bands. If you pull on one area, the other areas might shrink. So let's do that. If we pull on wealth and just maximize our wealth in life so that we end up trying to make as much as we possibly can, build as much as we possibly can in our wealth area, the reality is to do that, we have to give up time. We end up giving up time because we don't have time to do other things. We don't spend as much time maybe with our children. We don't spend as much time on vacations. We don't, whatever the time is. But the second part to that is we also probably give up on our health a little bit. Again, if you're spending your time focused on building wealth, you probably don't have as much time to work out. You probably don't eat as healthy as you could. You probably aren't getting quite as much sleep. And so from the standpoint of health, you're going to give up a little. So building wealth has a trade-off between health and time. Similarly, if we focus on time and we just make time the issue, I want to spend as much time with my loved ones doing fun things, whatever that looks like. The reality is I probably don't have as much wealth. I'm not going to build the pile as big. And then secondly, if I spend time doing other things, maybe I don't have enough time to focus on my health. For example, you might not spend as much time working out as you should, or you might cut corners and eat more junk food or whatever because you're just trying to maximize your time doing something else. And finally, if we maximize health, we're going to give up wealth and time. You've all heard stories, we all hear stories of people that focus on health from the perspective of going to the gym for hours a day. Well, if you do that, you don't have as much time to do fun things, and you probably aren't working quite as much. But it could also be the other side of this, which is people that are focused on basically doing anything and everything they can to maximize health, from vitamins to red light therapies to solar issues, cold plunges. I mean, you name it. There are things that you can do to probably help your health, but when you do that, you're going to spend more money and or give up time. So as we dig into this, I just want you to have this framework of health, wealth, and time. There is no way to balance this perfectly. And so I think there has to be a judgment call on your part about what piece is most important to you, and then what that means from a trade-off perspective. So what I want to do is I want to dig into each of these a little more detail. The first one I want to dig into is health. When we talk about health, health really is the foundation for longevity. That's kind of where the whole longevity movement started, is talking about health. And health is a easy thing to think about when we think about it in a very specific way. But what I did is I want to look at this chart. This chart basically shows what happens if we think about this from the perspective of our health span versus our lifespan. On this axis, we have health span. And if you think of the 50% line as we basically have about half our healthiness versus 100%, you can see that in general, we're all going to be fairly healthy for a long period of time. I don't know what time frame this is, but let's pretend that we're fairly healthy till we're 30 years old. And then it starts to come down a little bit. This dark line is if we don't really have a lot, excuse me, have a lot of healthcare. So there are countries where this obviously is an issue. Medicine 2.0 is the next dotted line. And what Medicine 2.0 is, and I'll define these things, is this is kind of the idea that we get our health care when we get sick. So it's not trying to prevent illness. Medicine 2.0 is where we're at today in the medical field. If we get sick, then we go to a doctor, get medicine, get operations, whatever it is. So Medicine 2.0, if you think about it, is going to keep us slightly healthy for a period of time, and then it might help us bowl that line a little bit. But what ends up happening out here, and let's pretend out here is somewhere around age 80, is it basically lets us extend our life period. But if you look at this, extend our life period probably way below that 50% line. So we're not really that healthy. We're probably on a lot of medications and doing whatever we can just to stay alive. But are we really having fun? Medicine 3.0 is the exact different perspective of that, which is what can we do to basically prevent illness altogether? This is the, hey, 20 years, 30 years out, what can we do? And if you look at that line, it bows way later in life. So really what the whole goal is to keep us healthier, longer period, so that when we finally kind of go downhill, we go downhill fast. It's kind of like a big cliff crash. So this is kind of where longevity comes from. Sometimes we hear about this when we listen to podcasts or are reading books. We might hear this presented in slightly different ways. One of the main things is integrative medicine versus like functional medicine. and there's slightly different reasons why one means something different than the other. But in general, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure this part out. So what it comes back to is some of the same stuff that we normally would expect, which is, nutrition is kind of a big piece to this. And when I say nutrition, I don't mean your diet. This is more about what your, makeup is. This is about your genetics and everything. And what ends up happening with uh, healthcare 3.0 is they really focus more and more on trying to find what deficiencies you might have with vitamins and genetics and things like that to try to move that curve by simply giving you some fixes that are simple, not prescription medicines, for example, and try to get the line moving that way. And people will swear by certain things when it gets into this topic. For example, if you really dig into it, red light therapy is talked about as a very big thing with some of the people that talk about this, because it supposedly does some things for you. So, you can try it and see, but if it didn't work, it's not going to harm you either necessarily. So that's the point to that. The second point, and this is all going to sound fairly standard in some ways, but physical fitness is a very big thing when it comes to longer term um, health. And I bring it up because I want you to think about it from the perspective that Dr. Peter Attia brings about in his book, Outlive. He talks about the centenarian decathlon. And when you think about health this way, it's actually a little bit different than I got to exercise. It's obvious that you have to exercise from the standpoint of trying to stay healthy, but I think in long term, we've always thought of exercise sometimes as doing more cardio, like running and things. And what he talks a lot more about is more of the heavy weightlifting type of stuff, from the perspective of the centenarian decathlon. So, what do you want to do at age 100 that you would need to be thinking about now? And so, I'm going to give you a short list of a couple ideas that he brings up. For example, hiking 1.5 miles on a hilly trail. Get off the floor with your own power and the help of only one arm. Pick up a small child from the floor. Carry 2 5-pound bags of groceries for 5 blocks. Lift a 20-pound suitcase into the overhead compartment of a plane. Balance on one leg for 30 seconds. Open a jar. Climb 4 flights of stairs in 3 minutes. Those are all good things to think about from the centenarian's perspective. And every one of us is going to have a different list, by the way. This is a very individualistic list because we all might want to do something different. For example, I know people who are getting close to 80 who still want to water ski. So when you think about this, though, what it does is it leads you to doing things differently when you exercise. For example, if you really want to open a jar, you might want to be thinking about hand strength, but hand strength also comes from our back muscles. And I think when you dig into this, you start to realize I got to lift weights a little different if I really want to be able to just have that kind of strength later in life. Or if I don't want to fall over and break a hip, I better start doing more lunges and things to help my balance while I'm still in my 50s, as opposed to getting to that point where that's not going to be very helpful. So I bring this up so that you can start thinking about what is your decathlon look like? And then what are you going to do today to start moving towards it? The third point to bring up is sleep. And I'm not going to get into every detail about sleep. There's some of the books on sleep are fantastic. But basically, if you don't sleep well, it leads to a lot of other issues like heart problems. It can lead to dementia and Alzheimer's and all kinds of issues. So the not sleeping part is kind of a big deal. And I think too many people don't spend enough time thinking about or going and seeking answers for their sleep issues. And the answers, by the way, aren't just getting a sleeping pill. That does not necessarily put you in a deep sleep. So there's a lot of other things people should be thinking about. The fourth issue is mental health, and I don't really want to talk about mental health. I prefer the term. I put it on this slide because everyone thinks of it that way. I prefer the term mental fitness. Mental health feels a little bit like a goal, like we're all unhealthy until we hit some magical goal. When the reality is, it's kind of like working out. Like there's a fitness aspect to it, and sometimes it ebbs and flows. Sometimes we just are mentally more with it than other times. So I think more about it from a fitness perspective. And what are you doing? Now I'm going to touch upon the mental health issue slash mental fitness issue a little later in my slides when I talk about some things that people should be thinking about doing. So I bring up some issues here from the perspective of these are things to consider. My last few slides are like, how do you put it in practice? My final point here when it comes to health, though, is it's medicine 3.0 is all about preventative care. And the one thing that you have in your pocket to make sure that this happens is cash. I say that because this is the mind shift. Medicine 3.0 is not about waiting until insurance picks up. Our current system of having insurance cover everything is kind of broken, especially when it comes to medicine 3.0. There are tests that you can do to find out if you have heart problems 20 years before you actually have the heart problem. But since the tests only costs $100 or something, you might want to run and do it because they're not that expensive, but your doctor might not prescribe it because technically you don't have a problem. And this is the kind of issue that I want to bring up because this is a real mind shift in thinking. Cash is king when it comes to preventing health issues. Go ahead and spend the money on some of these things. Go ahead and get some additional testing. A lot of this testing isn't that expensive. You're going to spend hundreds of dollars. You're not going to spend $50,000. And I think that's the one thing I would encourage everyone to reconsider is the role of cash versus the role of insurance in this new system. Let's jump into wealth. What's money's role in longevity? If you think about money, money has a interesting interplay with our health. If you look at this graph, this ability to do stuff when we're back here at age 0, we have all the ability in the world because we're the healthiest. And over time, as our age moves on, our ability to do stuff starts to decline because our health declines. But the problem is while we have the ability to do stuff, we don't have a lot of money. And so over time, the ability to have money increases. Now, the problem is, if you look at this chart, and this is really not that far off from the studies, our wealth tends to peak out here, usually in our 70s. But if you look at that, that's usually when we're starting to be the most unhealthy. And so where is that perfect point? Now, I'm not going to say this is the perfect point, but in general, this intersection between health and wealth tends to occur in our early 50s. So it really brings up the perspective from a wealth perspective side of things of when do you want to actually spend money? Because if we wait until we have the most amount of money, the reality is we probably physically can't do a lot of the things we want to do. I'm going to touch upon this topic again in a few slides, but I want you to start thinking about this because the optimal time to spend is in our 50s. Most of us wait way too long, even though the optimal wealth we might have is out here in our 70s. What I want you to start thinking about is the optimal wealth is in your 50s because that's when your optimal health is. Now, with that comes a couple of things to consider in all of this. One thing to consider is this idea, this concept of accumulation versus decumulation. Too many times, if I meet someone in their 50s, I run into people that have a lot of money in one type of account versus another. And the type of account they typically have a lot of is IRAs and 401k money. What I want you to start thinking about is think about diversification, not just as diversifying in the market, but diversifying in the types of assets you have so that you have different taxability. And that brings up this 50-50 ratio. If you have 90% of your money in an IRA or 401k, that means when you move forward, spending in the decumulation phase, it gets taxed at the income rates. And sometimes if you spend a lot of money, that means at some of the highest rates. Versus if you have money in just a brokerage account where it gets taxed at capital gains rates, your tax rate might be half. Or if you even do better than that, where you have money in a Roth IRA or some HSA money, you might not have any tax due. And so I want you to start thinking about this, because in an ideal world, if I could meet you in your 50s or 60 and say, it's time to think about what the next phase of life looks like, you would have probably half your money in 401ks and IRAs, but the other half in other stuff, so that we have a nice mix and can actually control tax costs on the way out. That doesn't happen a lot, to be honest with you, but that would be a goal. If you can pass anything on to your kids or grandkids, that's a big one, because they have time probably, even if you don't have time to fix that issue. The second thing to consider in wealth is housing. And what I want you to think about here is, what is the true cost of housing? What we're starting to see more and more of, especially as people live longer, is that renting is becoming okay. We're not seeing people have to hang on to homes like they used to. They're actually starting to say, I'm comfortable getting rid of it, because they start to recognize that the costs are not just taxes, insurance, and maintenance, but the true cost could be, for example, that I don't get to see my kids or grandkids because I decided I'm going to go to Florida forever and my kids are up in Minnesota. So what we're starting to see is more and more people say, I want to look at what the real cost to my life is, and am I happy? And so they're moving around more. And the other part to this, and I put it in parentheses, but I should have put it in bold, is people that hang on to homes thinking their kids want to inherit them are probably wrong. You can ask your children, but if they're honest, we see most kids and most grandkids say, the second mom and dad die, we're selling the house. We don't care. And this oftentimes comes into play with cabins, where the assumption is, well, I want the cabin to go on forever. Kids may not want it. And so I bring it up because I do want you to start thinking about it from the longevity perspective. Is it really adding value to what you want? And then secondly, knowing that they may not want it, maybe it's something you don't need to keep forever. The third one, legacy. Now, this is a big one. When we think about wealth as we live a long life, the standard practice over the last 50 years at least, or actually going back hundreds of years, has been, when you die, you give your money to your kids. What I want to challenge you on here is, your kids don't need it when you die. Your kids need your money between the ages of 25 and 35. That's when your kids need your money. If you think about when all of us struggled the most, it was basically as we were building our careers, our families, buying our first house, starting to save heavy for college. Those are the issues that are coming into play between the ages of 25 and 35. And what I'm running across more and more is, people don't want to just give it away when they die. They want to start thinking about, how do I help these kids while living, because I want to see the benefit of that help. And so we're seeing more and more people want to help them. And what I want you to think about is, when does that make sense? If you wait till you die and your child is 60 years old and they inherit millions, it won't matter. They've already gone through all the pain of life. They've already had to deal with all the lows, and they needed the money 20 years ago. So that's the thing that I want you to consider. And then the fourth topic when it comes to wealth is that estate planning doesn't end at the law office. Too often what we see is a couple of issues, really. One is, people decide that now's the time to talk about getting their wills and trusts in order. They go to see a lawyer, and then that's it. Few things occur. A, you need to, after seeing the lawyer, actually go retitle accounts, do all kinds of changing of beneficiaries, things like that, to actually implement what the lawyer wants you to do. This gets missed a lot, and we see that. But the second thing you want to consider in all this is, and you need to talk to your family about what you're doing. Now, when to talk about it is always the issue because a lot of times people don't necessarily want to share numbers. That's okay. But what I would encourage you to do is talk to your family earlier, not later. I think my parents' generation didn't talk about it at all. My grandparents' generation never talked about it. My parents' generation started talking about it maybe late in life, like, okay, I'm 85. I guess I can tell my kids what's going on. What I'm seeing, the Gen X generation, which is my generation, they've been talking to their kids more and more about money. So I think what I would encourage you to do is sit down with your kids early, like in their teens already, and really earlier than that. The conversation the earlier you start, the conversation is not we don't have money. The conversation is here's the choices we make so that we have the money to do what we want to as a family. And as that conversation changes, by the time your children hit their, late teens, early 20s, maybe you feel comfortable starting to share dollar amounts with them. The goal is not to make your kids think you're poor. The goal is to make them understand how hard you work to get there and how they might benefit from that a little bit. But it also has a calming effect. What you don't always realize, I think, is your family is nervous because they don't know what you have. So they don't know if you're taken care of. And they're nervous about living their lives thinking they might have to take care of you. So there's a lot of power here in talking to the family earlier, having these family meetings every so often. And I would encourage you to do it sooner. That's probably the one thing I can say has been helpful. And I'll tell you from experience, I did this with my own children um, fairly recently, and they're all in their late teens and early 20s. And I was amazed at what they came back and said because they kind of took the attitude of, this is your money. If you want to give us some, that's fine. But we would rather you and mom enjoy it. We would rather you guys give it to some charities that you like because we know you like these certain charities. And I think that was very helpful for my wife and I to also continue living without feeling this obligation. Now, let me jump into time. Time is the one asset we don't get back. And the way you want to think about this is that let's say you're 40 years old, you've got about 2,000 weeks left to your life if you live till age 80. So if you do the math backwards, if you're starting at zero, you have about 4,000 weeks in life. That's it. And after 4,000 weeks, you're probably done. I think it's important to think that way because I think we go week to week a little bit in a zombie mode where we just kind of do the same old stuff over and over and over, thinking we're living when the reality is we're not experiencing life. And I think that's the one thing I want you to start considering in the time you have left is what are you doing so that each week actually means something? Let me share a couple of ideas with you. Going back to this graph, if you remember health and wealth intersect over down here in your 50s, most people get to a point in life where they have to think about time a little differently. And they think about it in the moment sometimes. But what you should be thinking about it is go out 30 years. Let's say 30 years from now you die. You have a few $1,000,000 today, but 30 years from now you die and the math, your financial advisor runs the math and says you'll leave your kids at least $150,000. Well, let's pretend today you're maximizing your 401k. So you're putting 30,000 a year into the 401k, and then you're saving an extra 20,000 a year doing something else. You're saving $50,000 a year in your 50s. My question to you is if you know you're going to leave your kids 150,000, Is it better to work 3 more years so that they get the 150? Or is it better to, instead of retiring at 60, retire at 57, not work those 3 years? What would you do if you had 3 years in your healthiest period of life? What would you do different? And I think this is the question of time. We have moments of time when we can do things that we'll never be able to do again. A lot of us, for example, had dreams of jumping out of an airplane and skydiving. And then we had children. And for the rest of our lives, we'll never skydive because we don't want an accident to happen. And then we got the kid issue. So we should have done it prior to having children when we were in our 20s. Similarly, right now, in our 50s, those of us in our 50s might be thinking, well, I'd like to go hike Machu Picchu. But if I wait till I'm 65 or 70, will I have the health to do that? Or should I go hike it today? And I think it's these moments of time we got to start thinking about is what can I do today that I might not be able to do in 5 years or much less 20 or 30 years away? And then ask that question, is it worth giving up that time for money? Because that's the trade-off. So yes, I'm advocating people probably consider retiring a little earlier than they did. But I'm also advocating they start thinking about time differently. And maybe you don't have to quit work. Maybe it can be, you know what, I'm going to start taking a month's vacation once a year and doing some things that I've always wanted to do. Could be that. But I want you to start thinking about that trade-off. The second trade-off that occurs with time is what I'll call the social portfolio. We think of investment portfolios, but we often neglect social portfolios. And really where this comes into play is as we age, now this is specifically about aging, not about sex, but the reality is males have a harder time with this than females. But as we age, our social portfolio shrinks. And as we age, then loneliness becomes a problem because loneliness affects our mental fitness, and eventually that affects our physical fitness. And so what happens, and the studies are showing this, is that loneliness has a similar effect on our health as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. That is stunning when you think about what that means. So as we age, we have to worry about friendships. Now, this is a very difficult thing sometimes, but I always ask this question because I've looked at my own family. My mother is 90 years old, and I look at her and I say, how many more times am I going to see her in this life? At 90, if I saw her every Christmas, will I see her 5 more times? What if I add Christmas and Easter into it? Now I might see her 10 more times. If I see her once in the summer, maybe I'll see her 15 more times. You have to start asking that question a little bit because in building the social portfolio, I think we need to focus more on what time do I have and when do I use that time, as opposed to just going on what I said earlier, which is kind of like zombie land, where we just kind of keep moving forward, but we're not really sure why. Now, let me dig into this a little bit more. Some of the studies are showing that the social portfolio, if put into action, would suggest that we should have about 150 relationships as we age. That sounds like a lot, but if you think about it, what I'll point out is 2 of them might be this virtuous type of relationship. Those are our closest friends. They're our support structure. We call them when things are bad. We call them when we want to share things are good and we don't want someone thinking we're pompous. Those are the closest people. So think of this as a bullseye. In the center of the bullseye, the virtuous people are there first. The second part of the bullseye might be the fun people, where these are the people we enjoy hanging out with. And instead of 2 people, this might be 10 or 12 people. And then outside of that part of the bullseye, we have the utility people. The utility people are those people around us in our daily activities. It literally could be the barista at Starbucks who recognizes us when we come in and every time and says, hey, good morning, do you want your standard coffee? But utility is still important because it makes us feel like we belong to something. And so these people could be 50 or 100 different people, They're people we interact with for just minutes. They don't have to be for long periods of time. And then finally, we have the developing people. These people may be on the fringes of our lives, but we don't really have them built into our friendship structure yet as well as we'd like. But these people are important because these people, if we're being inquisitive, are the ones we want to figure out ways to get into our life and to keep growing in some way. This gets into, from an action step standpoint, a couple of things, but let me jump to this one here: repot, rekindle, and ritual. At different moments in time, we should be thinking about this from the standpoint of growing a plant. Sometimes we need to repot the plant. So when it comes to repotting, we might move someone from one of these areas to another. The one way I can think of this, for example, is we may have someone at work who we enjoy hanging out with, and we may go out for drinks after work once in a while with them, and they're just fun people. And then we retire, and we're all of a sudden like, oh my God, I'm never going to see that person again. What if we move them from fun down to virtuous or some other, get in some way, get them more into our lives differently? So repot just simply moves them from one area to the next. Rekindle is referring to the idea that sometimes we just got to add fertilizer. If you think about it, throughout life we have friendships that come and go. But when they go, are they gone forever or can they come back? And I think most of us get to a point in our lives where we recognize they can come back when the time is right. There are people we, for example, spend time with when our kids are in high school, where we're like, I really enjoyed them. Then our kids went off to college and I didn't see them for a while. But I remembered in the back of my mind they like to fish. And now that I'm retiring, I'm fishing more. Maybe I'll call them if they want to go fishing. There's ways to bring people back in. And then ritual is watering your plant. Ritual is simply spending time habitually with specific people at specific times. You could have a standing coffee date once a week. You could have a standing lunch date with all the guys you used to play football with in high school. You could have all kinds of so these rituals are very important from the standpoint of maintaining relationships. So think about this repot, rekindle ritual idea. Now, going back up the list, in all of these areas, here's some ideas. Make a list of the specific names in each category and think about where the gaps are. Because if you don't have certain people in certain categories, you might want to rethink why that is and how can you move people from one category to the next for whatever reason. Okay. Secondly, how do you get people from this developing category on up? Well, you need to meet them where they're at. So I think too many times, and I see this, I speak from the standpoint of some of my friends that are men as they've retired. Too many times people sit around and wait for life to happen. So I think what we want to push more and more is go meet people, meet them in church, in class, hobbies, whatever. My wife, whenever she goes out to visit our children in Montana, she goes on Meetup and she just sees what are local people doing on Meetup. And invariably she goes on a hike or a coffee or something with local people in Montana. And half the time meets people that are also from Minnesota looking for things to do, but also meeting people from California and wherever, and stays in touch with these people. And then when she goes back, she can hook up with them again. So I would encourage you to think about ways to do some of these kinds of things. So, and then finally, and I threw this on here because this is important. If you don't think you have time, stop watching TV. TV time and screen time in general triples in retirement. If you look at where people spend their time, the studies show that those things go from about 100 minutes a week to over 300 minutes a week. It's crazy how much time people spend doing this stuff. All right, I'm going to finish up with a couple of ideas. So if you have questions at all or want to ask questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A portion here. I want to go back to the idea that cash is king. I want you to start thinking about, how do I outsource to stay put? Meaning, most people want to maintain their lifestyle the way it is. A lot of people say, I want to stay living in my home. I don't want to end up going into, an assisted living facility, things like that. But too often what we see is they're not making decisions that can help them stay put. So the first one I'll just throw out there is the car service idea. There's a point in all our lives where we shouldn't be driving, right? But the old way of thinking about this is, I'm going to take the keys away. The new way of thinking about this is, I have the ability and the money to enjoy someone chauffeuring me around town. Now, whether that's using Uber, whether it's just using a limo service, or however you want to think about this, the reality is this isn't the most expensive thing. You can do these things. You can get out and go get groceries and go to the theater and meet friends, meet your grandchild for ice cream. Just do it without having to drive, and you can do it. So what I want you to start thinking about is, on this whole list, what are the things that you could spend your money on to buy yourself health and or time? Any of these issues come up. I've seen people use car services. Sometimes they'll hand off bill pay, and we can talk about those services if people ever need to. Simple food delivery services. Sometimes those can get expensive, but if it means you stay in your house, that can work. We've seen people, I know someone to put in an elevator in their house so that they could stay put. Any of these services are interesting ways to stay put. And this is not an exhaustive list. It's just a way to start thinking about it. The second thing to consider with cash is this idea of medicine 3.0. More and more and more, we're seeing this idea of integrative medicine, where people are looking into ways to find their genetic deficiencies and fix them naturally. And if you start to dig into this, you will come to the conclusion quickly that the food supply in America is definitely dirty. And there's some things you can probably do to get around that. So I would encourage you to start thinking about those issues. One example I throw on here is this website. I'm not endorsing it, but this Function Health was started by a doctor who basically allows you, for a small membership fee every year, to get lab results every 6 months. And from that, he tests like 100 different things and gives you ways to improve each thing. And it's all natural. It's just a different way to think about it. And then third, by the way, I throw in telemedicine, because we're going more and more towards other ways to get medicine. And I find that there are things like telemedicine that are interesting only because too often I think people aren't going to see doctors when they should, or have those consultations, because they don't want to either spend the time or whatever reason. Telemedicine is an interesting way to get around that. As I close up, here's some other resources to think about reading. I've read all these 3 books, and in preparing for this outline today, I actually am using some material from each of these books. But if you really want to read about health, Outlive is a fantastic book. It's extremely thick, so I warn you, but it is a very interesting book. Die with Zero gets in more of this idea of the trade-off of wealth and time. And then From Strength to Strength talks a little bit more about purpose and how we shift from our work purpose to our next phase purpose, whatever that might be. And then finally, MIT Age Lab, that's a website. If you want to go read more about this, the MIT has hooked up with some money managers in our business that are helping fund it, but they really spend a lot of time researching how people age, things they can do to improve their life. And for example, I got some of the concepts around loneliness from MIT Age Lab. I've seen them speak many times. So if you want to go get more information, these are interesting resources to look at. Certainly not only resources. I'm not listing all the podcasts I listened to on this, but there are plenty. What I will finish with is just so you're aware, I am going to be starting a podcast. It'll be starting in the next few months. So take take a gander at that when it comes out. I'm sure everyone on this call will be aware of it. In our next webinar, we will be dealing with our quarterly economic update. And so when we're come back for that, I hope you can sign up and hear more about numbers, not just theories of how to age better. If any of you have any questions after this and you want to get in contact with me, here's my email address. You can certainly call me. That's my line, and we can chat more about it. Or if you have any ideas as to what else you'd like to see, feel free. At this point, I don't see any open questions. So I guess I will say thank you for attending today. And if you do want to talk in the future, let me know. But otherwise, hopefully I'll see you in the next webinar, and I hope you have a great day.